Hi, my name is Dale Adams of Planning Ahead of Time, and this week I'm speaking with Tina. Tina, it's been nice to meet you already this morning, and would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, Del. Thank you for having me on the podcast. This is a lovely opportunity. I'm Tina Naldrett, and I live in Devon, and I'm a nurse and a celebrant.
Okay, so you're a celebrant in Devon, and you were in nursing before you became a celebrant, is that right?
That's right, yeah. I started my nursing career many years ago, but in the last 7 years of my career, I was very drawn to working in the hospice sector. So I worked as a nurse in a hospice in the Exeter, East Devon area. And yeah, the most rewarding part of my career, I think.
Okay. So how long were you in hospice care, and what were you sort of doing within it?
Yeah, well, I was the lead nurse within the whole organisation. So I hate this phrase, but I was in charge of all the other nurses. But the power of that, if you're not a power crazy human, allowed me to set the standard of the care that I wanted everyone to receive in the hospice. And part of the care was also in people's own homes. So lots of people were employed in that hospice, including spiritual leaders, nurses, doctors, and other healthcare professionals. And it was just wonderful place to work, really happier than people anticipate a hospice might be, actually. And I had the opportunity, and I like to be the kind of nurse leader who wandered around trying to find people doing good stuff, and often would end up having conversations with families and patients in our care. And so I think that's why I enjoyed it so much, because it was a charity, and that allowed us the time to really have some fantastic conversations with people about death and dying. And I think hospices, they should be nailing the death, dying, and dead conversations. I used to call them all the D words.
Yes, yeah, I agree with you. And I think people, I believe there's a misconception about hospices,
Mm.
where people think you literally go there to die.
Mm.
That isn't always the case, is it?
No, you get all sorts of people there. You get people preparing to die, and it is their final days. You get people who are planning for how to spend this time that they have left. They've just found out that the time that remains is not as much as they'd hoped for. And they're just planning how to use that best, and they're understanding how to manage their symptoms and what things are possible. When you know you haven't got as long as you hope for, the world around you changes, and your decision making changes as well, and your priorities. So it kind of is a place where you can chat that through with clinical professionals and also death professionals, I suppose. And for some people, it's a great opportunity to do a bit of planning about what you want beyond that time. When death is near, um, it's often the absolute moment to start talking about this stuff if you haven't, as a family, talked about it previously.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a moment ago, which was quite interesting because I don't think I've ever heard this before, of a spiritual leader in the hospice.
Yeah, well, we the hospice is often another way it's labelled incorrectly sometimes, is that they are religious places. Some hospices were funded and did begin in a way that was funded by churches, but many of them aren't. And a lot of people have a sense of spiritual need. They want to connect with something outside of themselves that feels supportive, but they wouldn't call that religion or faith. Some people do, and some people don't. So a spiritual lead is employed because they will work with anyone who just wants to explore that kind of stuff. Like, is there an afterlife? What will happen to me? Um, is there or isn't there a God? These are often the times in our lives when we might ask these kind of questions. And also families, it can help them to sort of start to think about how they want to deal with their person not being present as a physical thing, in the future when they've died.
Yeah. And I do think a lot of the time when people are thinking about death and dying, and
Mm.
they realise obviously the end is imminent, even if that's months away. But like you say, they know there's a terminal illness, they're planning for it. They don't often think beyond actually that person dying, and it is the preparation for also how they are going to cope afterwards, not just with the information and and the processes they've got to go through, which are in themselves quite hard when it's done, all the paperwork and all the administration that comes with that, but also how they are going to cope and what they might need for themselves when one has died.
Yeah. Because you're preparing for something very different. You might be preparing for, excuse me, a single life when you've always been a couple. You might be preparing for a childless life or a siblingless life, you know, that you're preparing for that gap really, and what you're going to do when that gap happens. And I think it helps us all to have these conversations. I'm sure, Dale, somebody said this before on your podcast, but talking about sex will not make you pregnant.
Yeah.
And talking about dying will not make you die any sooner than you were going to. So I think we are afraid of talking about it because we think somehow we're going to make it come quicker. And in the hospice and in my current job, we certainly try and encourage those conversations, because I always say it's like having house insurance. You have it, it's sat on the shelf, you've talked about it, the plan is sitting there. It doesn't mean your house is going to burn down tomorrow. It's just like your insurance policy. And most of us have got house insurance. So that's why I really encourage people to have future plans, conversations about those. Sometimes they're more rushed than you hope for because, you know, you've had some surprising news about your death, but so useful, so useful.
So you now work as a celebrant. Okay. And how did that come about? And what areas? I think you said you're in Devon, but where are you covering with that work?
I cover mainly Devon. I have gone to other places, but that's mainly been through personal connection, family connection. When I was working at the hospice, I ended up doing some funeral eulogies for people because we got to know one another and they asked me. There are a few occasions on which I definitely help people plan for their funeral. One person wanted to have what I think is currently being termed a funeral. So she wanted a party before her death, because she said, all these people that are going to get together when I'm gone, you know, I really love most of them and I'd like to be there. So we planned an event. She loved Wimbledon. She was poorly around that time of year, funnily enough. And we just opened up a huge space in the hospice, and she had it for a party. And there were strawberries and cream, and Wimbledon was on, and there was champagne, and loads of people came to that. And they had to do fancy dress, like tennis fancy dress. It was really funny, Dale, actually. And the person whose event this was, she organised everything. And I helped with that. I helped with, you know, getting the invites sorted out and the catering. And it was like having a party, really. And she called that her funeral. So that was what happened to prepare everyone for her death. And she went around, she was an amazingly courageous person, went around the room saying, you know, try not to be too sad. Whenever Wimbledon's on, just think of me. You know, I'll be watching Heavenly Wimbledon, is what she said. So I got involved in stuff like that. I also got involved in just sitting with people, and often as a family unit, doing a bit of preparation. So sometimes the person dying would say, I want to have a conversation, Tina, but they just keep saying, oh no, don't talk about that. Come on, let's not talk about that. She said, I want to have a conversation. I want to tell them what music I would like, and you know, what flowers, what arrangements, basically. And so I would often be there enabling that to happen and treating it just really normally, like we were planning a holiday. I think if you just try and treat these things normally and not put too much emotional emphasis on them, the conversations happen gently and often in a quite amusing way, and not anywhere near as scary as everybody thinks. So that's how it started for me. Got involved in all of that and thought, I think some people might do this as a job. Looked more into it, found out that there was this thing called Celebrant, and went off and did my training. And that's a history, really, Dale. I've been a Celebrant now for about 4 years.
Brilliant. Okay. And it's through that work that you've now moved on to actually doing a podcast with somebody else.
Mm.
You need to tell us how that evolved from one to the other.
Yeah, Del, do a podcast. It's called Good Goodbyes, and it's with a funeral director, independent funeral director in my patch, and he's called Simon Savage. And we came together around several funerals. And after a particular funeral where the person who had the funeral or celebration of life was in their 30s, they had a learning disability, and the family wanted it to be incredibly celebrative. It was a sudden death because he died suddenly and no one expected it. He was literally one of these life and soul of the party kind of characters. He had his set go-to karaoke, which was the song "I'm Sexy and I Know It," and I said to Si, we really need to dance and sing, and this is what the family want us to do. And Si looked horrified, not at the fact that we were going to do this. He was really happy with that, but the fact that I was going to make him dance and sing as well, because I said everybody in the hall has got to join in.
Right.
And so we had, afterwards, we were like, gosh, isn't it funny how a lot of people wouldn't know that that was possible as an option at anybody's funeral. I mean, not everyone would choose that. Obviously, there's a whole range of things that people would choose, from a very traditional setup to something like that. And we just got into conversation, and we got into conversation about how much of this whole business is very mystifying, the language. What's a catafalque? What's a verger? What do you have to put in the order of service? Do you have to have flowers? Do you, when you come to choosing music, what's the best way to think about it? And I said to him that I thought it would be really powerful to make that informal and conversational. And we created a podcast. And it's only been going for 2 months, but it's already had a really good take up. And I'd like to think it's because it's just giving people those helpful snippets of information.
Absolutely. And it really is so important. People don't know. They don't know what they can do. And often they are making those decisions in some of the hardest times of their life.
Mm.
And so they can be just guided. And sometimes they literally end up with, if you like, quite a traditional funeral, but the person that they're doing that for would have wanted, or they would have preferred something a little bit more personalized and maybe elaborate or flamboyant, depending on the character, because it is a celebration of life at the end of the day. That it's obviously extremely sad. There's an awful lot of grief that surrounds death, which is understandable, and it does cut us to the core when we lose people that we love. But equally, we've had that time with them, they've had that life, and we celebrate their life and who they were. And so I think, yeah, what you're doing is also equally important, isn't it? We're all just trying to get people to have these conversations and make people normalize it. And you used the word earlier about making it a normal conversation, and that's what we're trying to do, because it does happen.
Yeah, and I think part of the gift of a celebrant is to be creative. So once you listen to families, and you make such a good point about, knowing people and individualizing and personalizing the service is a huge part of it. And also holding a safe space for grief. So one example would be that people often would say to me, oh, I hope I don't cry. And we talk about how that would be fine to cry. Someone has died. This is a really significant loss. And loss often shows itself through all sorts of things. And some of that might be crying. That it's okay to include children. So I've had quite a few debates in the last couple of years about children being at ceremonies, children doing anything at ceremonies. And I did a ceremony last year, and I found it really touching because so many grandchildren had a really strong relationship with the older person who died. And they were all saying, well, they're all going to be there, but, we're worried about them, the grandchildren. And I said, well, let's do something for the grandchildren. So what we did was there were 7 of them. We tied 7 different coloured ribbons, if you can imagine this, around the wrist of Grandad. He was in the coffin. Then they were long enough, the ribbons, so that they came out of the end of the coffin. So when the coffin was sealed, there were tiny bits of ribbon sticking out the end, if you can imagine this. And then at a point in the service, I said, Grandad is holding these ribbons, and now I'm going to cut the ends of them, and each of the grandchildren is going to have one of these ends of these ribbons. And that is what we created for that family. Now, when those grandchildren were given, they came up and they got their ribbons. One of them was quite bossy and came up and got most of the others' ribbons. It was a lovely little moment. And there were lots of crying from everyone who was there around that moment. And they were crying, but isn't it special and important that they've all got something that Grandad is always holding, that they had that moment in time to be able, even as youngsters, to understand this thing of somebody leaving who's never going to come back, and trying to, in their own small ways, get their heads around it. So I think that's a hugely important thing for me, Dale, is the individualizing of ceremonies. I'd like families to listening to this to think, oh wow, you know, I should ask my celebrant or my officiant, whoever that might be, how can they individualize this service for me and the person who's died?
I think it's absolutely beautiful. I've not heard of anything like that before with the ribbons, but I think that's so special. And as you say, the fact that he will always have the other side of that, because I'm working with some people at the moment on an end of life book for children, and the things they do consider a lot of the time children are the forgotten mourners. Because adults feel it's adult conversation, or children don't get invited. I can remember when I was very little, I wanted to go to my nana's funeral. I was told I couldn't go, and I didn't go. And I still, to this day, remember the fact that I wasn't able to go, and I would have liked to have gone. But I was told that everybody would be sad and crying, and it wasn't the place for children. Whereas now, when my children's granddad died, and they were 9 or 10, all of the grandchildren went, and they all sort of spoke, and they at his funeral. And I think it's really, children do need to understand, it's not like when you just lose a toy, because people say, oh, we've lost them, you know, and it's because children think they're going to find them again. So I think that's just absolutely beautiful what you did there. So,
oh, thank you.
If people would like to get hold of you, Tina, how do they get in touch with you?
There's lots of different ways, which is always a good thing, isn't it? I've got a website. My Celebrant business is called Camomile Ceremonies, and it's just www.camomile, the English spelling, CAMOMILE, ceremonies.com. So you can find me there. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook, either Tina Naldrett or Camomile Ceremonies. And you can listen to Good Goodbyes, which is on Spotify and Apple, wherever you listen to your stuff, really. And that has a fan button, so you can always kind of message us via that as well, if you would like.
Wonderful. And I'll also put the details at the end of this chat, and this will go up on YouTube if anybody wants to watch it as well. But look, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been really interesting.
Oh, Dale, thank you so much for giving me this space to talk about it all. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.